Well, welcome everybody. Glad you can make today's webinar that Elaine has generously structured and provided a space for. So I'm going to be talking about kind of the do's and don'ts of reaching out to your estranged or alienated child. And just so people know in advance, my area of focus and expertise is more around adult children. So the advice I'm going to be giving may or may not apply to if you have children who are minors. If they're alienated, some will apply and some won't. But in general, most of the advice and recommendations and feedback that I'm going to give are going to be oriented towards the adult child. And just to make things simple, the words estrangement and alienation, I know in some communities have different meanings. For my purposes, I'll be using the word estrangement to mean really any way that an adult child can become cut off with contact from their adult child. So alienation is one of those reasons, when a parent poisons a child against the other parent in the ways that is sadly common. So that's one pathway. Divorce in general can be a pathway, even if there's not alienation, where the child may independently of the parent's behavior choose one parent over the other. Often happens with dads and daughters in divorce. We know now that 26% of fathers are estranged from their children. They are 22% more likely to be estranged from their daughters. So after divorce, they become particularly at risk. Mental illness in the parents and addictions in the parents certainly, but also mental illness or addictions in the child. When what I call the cult of one, when a troubled son-in-law or daughter-in-law marries your child and they say basically, choose them or me, you can't have both. That's another pathway to an estrangement. Another pathway is bad therapists, that parent therapists who sort of assume that every problem that an adult child has must have a traumatizing parent at its home. All these therapists today who are encouraging going no contact, and it's not just therapists today. It's also Instagram influencers, TikTok influencers. These are people often who have very little training. They're just somebody out there who might have had a bad experience with a parent and assuming that their experience is like everybody else's, and so talking to young populations who may be much more vulnerable to that kind of an influence. Sometimes adult children don't know any other way to feel separate from the parent other than to cut off contact with them, particularly in the past 4 or 5 decades when parents have become much more intensive, much more involved, much more anxious, much more guilt-ridden, to some extent more intrusive, because parents have just needed to do more to get their children up through the narrow bottleneck into getting into a solid adult life. So parents have been much more involved, and that, in many ways that can turn out to be a good thing. But some adult children, they actually get too much of the parent and don't know any other way to feel separate from the parent than to cut off contact. So those are the common pathways to estrangement. And if you read all the articles that are coming out today about going no contact, should I cut off my family member, why I went no contact, they're always written from the adult child's perspective. And they always assume, an abusive parent is the cause of it. And those cases certainly exist. I'm a psychologist. I work with those cases. I'm not saying they don't exist, but they don't constitute all of the cases of estrangement. And there's also relatively little that's being said in popular media about the impact on parents. That even if we might all agree, well, yeah, I can see why that person cut off that parent, it's still a cataclysmic event for the family. It divides. Typically, grandchildren get cut off from grandparents. It might hurt the parents' marriage because they're going to have different ideas about whether to reach out, whether to not reach out. One sibling may line up to support the estranging child. Another sibling might line up against them. Aunts or uncles may step in to side with one side over the other. So estrangement in our society is a cataclysmic event that's dividing families. And it can't just be looked at purely from the perspective of, well, is this in the adult child's best interest or not? We have to think of our society and families as a whole and as a system. And we have rising rates of mental illness, atomization, loneliness, depression, social isolation. And it's in part, it's not the only reason, but it's in part because we're becoming much more divided against ourselves, becoming much more preoccupied with boundaries boundaries and limit setting and who's a narcissist and who's a gaslighter, and how I need to protect myself from their influence, and not nearly enough time and energy is spent on notions like interdependence and care and responsibility and compassion for other people. So that's all kind of in the 10,000 feet up, just to provide sort of background about the way that I think of some of these issues. So to get into the topic of kind of how I should reach out to a child who's cut off contact, I think the first question is really whether I should reach out to them. And I think that one of the best ways to think about an estrangement is that it occurs on a continuum from temporary and resolvable to maybe irresolvable, maybe permanent. We never know. I worked with families even had a 20-year estrangement, and now they're back in contact. Sometimes because the parent just writes a good amends letter, other times for other reasons. But I don't think anybody should ever completely give up hope, but I also don't think people should kind of try to white knuckle it through life. So it's a very confusing thing that happens for parents, because if they have made parents, they wonder, well, are my efforts slowly and silently having a positive effect? Or are they slowly and silently having a negative effect? Or are all my efforts a complete waste of time because my child's already decided that they're not coming back no matter how perfectly I behave? So I think one of the things that you have to be clear about is whether you even want to try, because whether you have it in you to keep trying if you've been trying, because what might be better for your child or even a potential reconciliation may not actually be better for you. And that may mean that you decide not to continue to work on it. Now, this is particularly confusing terrain for mothers, because moms are socialized to always put themselves last, always keep trying. So if you're on the fence, let me start by saying, maybe you shouldn't try. Here's the case against trying. Maybe it just costs you too much psychologically. Maybe trying means having to remain open to somebody who's just basically dumping raw sewage on you every time you reach out to them. Maybe trying means that your self-esteem gets constantly put up on the auction block for the lowest bidder, which happens to be the one person whose opinion you care the most about, your child. Maybe it's hard to keep trying because the rejection from your child reminds you too much of how rejected you felt by your own parents or family, and you just don't have that much to give because so much of your energy goes to every day to trying to feel like you have a right to be alive or have any kind of a life, even before the trauma of estrangement was visited upon you. So what I want to emphasize is that part of healing from an estrangement is reclaiming your definition of yourself as a parent and as a person. If you only let your child decide what kind of parent you are or were, or what kind of person you are or were, you're not only doing yourself a disservice, you're doing them a disservice. You do them a disservice because you give them much more power than they actually deserve to have. You may confuse them by implying that they have a bigger claim against you than they really do. You may enable them by rubber stamping their mistreatment of you. So how might you know that it's time to give up based on your own feelings, regardless of your child's response? Well, it could be if the following are true, where contact or lack of contact makes you feel suicidal or deeply depressed, or it takes you a long time to recover your balance after contact or reaching out and getting rejected, or you feel chronically enraged, or you're more motivated by guilt than a real desire for reconciliation, which is also a harder one for moms to know when to not respond out of guilt, since so many women's self-definition is tied to being a good mother. So I just want to start off by saying, and clearly for the record, that if you feel like it's better for your mental health, younger generations are very preoccupied with what's good for their mental health and often say that cutting off contact with the parent, they're doing it because it's better for their mental health. Well, guess what? You get to also prioritize your mental health and say to your child in your mind, you know what? I love you. I feel like I've tried really hard to empathize, repair whatever mistakes I've made or address your concerns, if you've even told me what those were. But I'm letting go of the reins here. I won't be calling anymore, writing, or depending on how it makes you feel, sending gifts either. Now, I'll get into the particulars of how and what you say, but that's what you say to yourself, not to your child. Now, honestly, for a percentage of kids, they're going to feel relieved that you've stopped reaching out to them and you may not hear from them again. That is a sad reality. There are some adult children who, no matter how perfectly the parent manages the estrangement, they may never open the door. They may be too troubled, they may be too ensnared by your ex in the case of alienation, or who they're married to, or upset about the past, whether that's reasonable or not. However, for other people, doing just that, completely dropping the reins, letting the line go cold for at least a year, can sometimes have a positive effect for the following reasons. One is that your child might respect you more for it. Our continuing to reach out despite their rejecting us can make us look like we're doormats. Now, I know I'm confusing you because I talk a lot about the importance of amends, and I'm going to talk about that more in the second half of my talk, because I do think that you always have to start with amends. But it can work to let go because they may feel like you're respecting their wishes more, that you're respecting their requests. They've said they don't want to be in contact. You're accepting that they're not going to be in contact. It may also allow them to miss you more. You know that old saying, how can I miss you if you never go away? Well, that's also true in families. If we're constantly showing how available we are, even if they're not responding, they don't have to face the ways that they miss us when we're not there. They're still getting something from us that may be enough. Not continuing to reach out may invite more self-reflection on the part. If we continue to reach out no matter how badly we're being treated or ignored, your child isn't forced to do the same kind of self-reflection. They might if the parental contact suddenly dries up. It's like if you're in an argument with somebody, if you stop arguing and keep yelling, at some point they have to look at themselves more clearly than if you keep it going. Finally, if you only say what kind of a parent you were, you're sacrificing your own claim to all of your own good memories together, all the ways that you may have sacrificed and have provided for them. So to go back to the continuum, and in general, an estrangement should be looked along several dimensions. One is the age of your child, the length of the estrangement, the quality of the communication or lack thereof, the mental health of the child, role of ex-spouses or other important families, such as your parents, in-laws, former in-laws, friends, your history of the child, stressors, mistakes, etc. So let's do a deeper dive into these, and starting with the age of the child. In general, with younger kids, I mean minors, probably up until the age of 26, so they're not really even grown into their brains until they're, 26. I think that it may just be an identity crisis that your child is going through. There was a recent study that found that 20-somethings these days are not doing well. They're much more vulnerable to depression. They're more socially isolated. They're more lonely. So they're also more vulnerable to a therapist or a TikTok influencer who's going to say that the reason for their problems is bad parenting, and the best solution to that problem is to in contact with the parent. So for a minor or an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old to say, I never want to speak to you again, you still have to have a strategy around it, but you don't have to take it to heart in the way that, say, a 50-something might or a 40-something might, or that kind of thing. And the reason for that is that younger people are more vulnerable to wanting to aggressively separate, individuate by blaming you, shaming you, rejecting you. If their lives aren't successful, if they haven't really launched, they may need to blame you as a way to blame themselves, avoid blaming themselves. It may be a way to say, well, you're the reason my life hasn't gone well. It's not my fault. In order to feel like their own person, they may need to reassure themselves that they don't need you, and may only be able to do that by devaluing you. In other words, if you're terrible, why should I miss you? So, after that, the older they get, even though they may not have congealed into the kind of person that we would have hoped, or maybe they would have hoped, they're probably largely who they're going to be. Therefore, if there's going to be a change, it's not typically as much as they're growing out of it, although that can happen theoretically at any age, or getting enough confidence and self-esteem that they can stop blaming us. It may be because of the efforts that we do make, or other life changes. And that doesn't mean that you keep pushing no matter what until they're 30. Overall, I think parents should try to reach out with a really good amends letter to follow up in the way that I'm going to talk about later on in this lecture. So what might we consider to be good signs? I think, you occasionally, even once yearly, get a birthday card, thank you note, email, etc. You have any contact face-to-face. You have a relationship with your daughter-in-law, son-in-law, or grandkids. Your child has told you that it isn't permanent, but they need some time and space. The estrangements are on and off, or you've been through an estrangement in the past and your child came out of it. Now, while these show that there's some opening, that doesn't mean that you're obligated to keep trying or that you should like what you're being given. As one mother said to me, I'm not going to make a 3-layer cake out of these crumbs I'm being given by my child. So most parents who are being given just those crumbs feel understandably upset and hurt because the relationship is so at odds with what it once was or what the parent thought it would be at this point in their life or the life of the parent. But it shows that there's some little kind of coals, embers to work on to maybe fan into a flame slowly over a long period of time. It shows that they have you on their radar, however dissatisfying and unfulfilling that is for you. And so in those scenarios, if you have it in you, I recommend that you keep it positive. Continue to reach out, but if you've been reaching out for a year and your kid's a full-fledged adult and you've gotten nothing back, then I don't think you should continue to reach out. I think you should give it a year of no contact. If you haven't made amends, make amends. Avoid guilt trips, avoid criticisms. So another indicator of whether or not it may be resolvable in the near future is the mental health or how addicted or alcoholic your child is. Poor mental health in your child may cause you to either reach out longer in some cases or give up more quickly in other cases. You should reach out longer if your child may need to blame you for a longer period of time for all the ways that they feel defective. Well, it's your fault I have problems with intimacy. It's your fault I'm bad with money. It's your fault that I don't have any confidence or self-esteem. You might need to take on more than is completely right as a way to help them get the shame or self-criticism off of themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that you do it in some anguished, guilty way. Often these interactions are more about the music than the lyrics. If the kid says, it's your fault I haven't done more with my life, you could say for a while, well, yeah, I think it would have been better if we had done more of X or Y for you. That you may be right about that. You don't lose a lot that way, and it may help them to not blame themselves or feel more hopeful. Or interested rather in being more hopeful about themselves. They may also respect you more if you don't get too defensive. Now, on the other hand, that doesn't mean that they're entitled to be abusive to you or just demand more money or favors from you no matter how terribly they're treating you. And also, you don't have to be in a position of kind of apology forever. It's something I recommend you do for some period of time, 3 to 6 months, so your child can know that you can kind of tolerate it. But at some point you might say, well, we have talked about this and I feel like I've made amends and have taken responsibility, but it doesn't really seem like it's changing anything in our interaction. So I'm wondering if there's something else you need to hear from me, or there's some other way I can respond that would make you feel more heard or seen or cared about. Maybe we should go meet with a therapist so we can work on this together. Now, what if you have on and off estrangement? So from my perspective, an on and off is better than a completely off one. Often it means the following things. Your child is struggling with issues around independence or identity. They don't know how to be close to you without feeling triggered in some way, such as feeling criticized or worried or guilty. One of the ways to think about this is that the ability to be close to a parent is a kind of psychological achievement in the same way that being able to have a romantic relationship is a psychological achievement. Now, why do I say that? It's because to be romantically involved, you have to have the capacity to sort of lose yourself in that oceanic feeling of love that you feel when you're having sex or you're first falling in love with somebody. You don't know where the boundaries are between you and them. We feel like we're one. There's poems and songs, and stories all written about that oceanic feeling. But at the same time, if you're not psychotic, you also have to hold on to a sense of your own self, your individuality, so you're not lost in the other person. And I think a certain percentage of estrangements happen and go on because the parent is actually too important and too big in the mind of the child. That's why I sometimes say to some parents, your child has to lose you in order to find themselves. It can feel like you're not at all important in your child. They can make you feel like you're not at all important. But sometimes that's really for their own self-dialogue. They're trying to make you unimportant because you're actually too important. Because if you say something critical or negative or whatever, guilt-inducing, it's some hugely consequential thing to them. It's not some trivial event like it might be if somebody else said it. So they don't know how to be close to you and hold on to their own sense of individuality because you're too big, you're too important in their minds. So for some kids, when they go in and out of estrangement or they estrange in the first place, it's because they just don't know how to be in your presence and still feel like they're their own person. So they just are too vulnerable to feeling guilty or triggered or upset in some kind of way. Another reason why they might have an on and off estrangement is that they feel some tug of war of loyalty, either with the alienating parent or the person that they're married to, or some other family member that maybe they choose to be close to you, and then the other family member says, well, why are you going, back with them? Why are you spending time with them? They're so toxic, they're so difficult. And they're just not developed enough to know how to really push back against that and still stay close to you. So there are many reasons for an on and off estrangement. It may also be that you as the parent haven't really changed enough for them. You're still too critical or guilt tripping, or you're still too negative about their ex, even if the ex is a major alienator. There's things that we have to work on too as parents. So if it's on and off, it's typically best to let the adult child come in and go as they see fit. Sometimes it's not personal, and other times it may start out not personal but become personal if the child feels criticized for wanting to be in charge of how much contact there is. Now, it's not unusual for an estrangement to end with the child saying, okay, I'm ready to be back in contact again. The parent gets all excited, understandably so. They plan a visit, and maybe the visit never happens. Or they plan a visit, they have the visit, seem like the visit went well, and then they go back into being no contact. Well, typically, the reasons that happens are the ones that I just gave. So you want to try to not sound critical if you're observing that your child is less available than they were before. Your child has busy life, and while they're at the forefront of our heart and minds, particularly if we have grandchildren, we're not at the forefront of their hearts and minds. So criticizing, complaining is never going to buy you anything. If your child acts triggered by something you've said, you could say, look, I just love seeing you. I know you have your own life. I'm just hoping we could get together sooner or later. I hope you'll let me know. Or if there was an earlier complaint about you and you have had some contact, you could say, well, look, I'm wondering if you're still having feelings about the past. The door is always open to talk about that. Now, I would do that with a kid who's somewhat psychological and isn't going to either see that as a sign of weakness in you or an opening to humiliate you, as some of these kids will, particularly those who are more troubled. So while some, the healthier ones, would see it as a sign of strength that you can reference an earlier complaint that your child had about you and be willing to revisit it, others might see it as you being guilt-ridden, and that might make them feel like they have a bigger right to complain than they actually should. Now, if you can't tell which is more helpful, it may be useful to do a number of these interventions and see which gets you a better response. Either way, I cannot stress enough the role that guilt plays in many estrangements. The old days, and in some cultures still, parents could guilt trip their kids into being in contact. Wasn't considered such a terrible thing to do. These days, if you guilt trip your kid, you're being a narcissist, you're being toxic, you're crossing boundaries, you're being a gaslighter. So you really need to avoid anything that sounds like a criticism or a complaint. Now, parents will sometimes say to me, oh, well, when do I get to say how I feel? And I'm like, well, you can say how you feel whenever you want to say how you feel, but it's not going to be strategic if it drives your kid away from you. You may have to accept or tolerate, if you want a relationship with your child, that it's going to feel kind of unequal to you. It's not going to feel fair to you. You may not really be able to talk about what your experience was like, but for a lot of parents, they're willing to accept that if it means having at least some contact with their child and grandchild. But there's no right and wrong here. You might say, well, I don't accept those terms. And I'll be like, all right, that's fine. You don't have to. I'm not telling you it makes you a bad person or a good person to accept or to not accept those terms. My mission is to help parents have a way to reconcile with their children. And sometimes parents are willing to do what I recommend, and sometimes they're not. And that's okay. So continuing to move across the continuum to not very hopeful, we have those parents who have gotten any of the following: restraining orders or the threat thereof, had the police called on them, Email is blocked. All gifts are returned. They've moved, not giving you a return, a way to reach them. All gifts to grandchildren are returned. Any attempt at contact elicits a rageful response. At this end of the continuum, your chances are much smaller, realistically, for an immediate reconciliation. Things are just too inflamed. You're not going to be able to reach a child who's so upset or mentally ill or aggravated or inflamed from the alienation or who they're married to, that any good is going to come from you continuing to reach out. I know it's counterintuitive for us as parents. We feel like if we just show up, never do it. If we just show up, they'll remember who I am. They won't have this caricature of me that they have in their mind. They'll remember that I'm actually a good person, that we had lots of good memories together. They'll remember all the good things that I did for them. But no, if they're successfully alienated, or they've concluded for all the reasons that these kids conclude that they don't want to have a relationship with you, so much so that they were threatening police and restraining orders, then the door has to be treated as closed. And in those situations, I recommend that you not do anything. Now, I used to recommend to parents that they write what I would call a Dear John letter, meaning that you sort of said, well, it's clear that my being in contact isn't good for you, so I'm going to stop for now. But now I don't recommend that anymore. Now I think you should just let the line go cold completely. Why? Because your goal is to invite self-reflection. Your goal is to make them wonder, kind of think about, I haven't heard from my parent in 6 months. That's unusual. Oh, that's right. I told them I was going to call the police on them or file a restraining order. Do I really need to do that? Let me think about it. Yeah, I kind of do. But if it's been a year or something, then people change sometimes, or they soften or whatever. And I think a year is a good amount of time, because after a year, you can reach out and say something like, look, I'm just checking in with you. I know my reaching out before wasn't helpful. And if you still need to be no contact, I will respect that. Just want to reiterate that I'm open to doing family therapy if that would be helpful, or if there are things that you would like to work on with me in work on in my own therapy, I would welcome that as well. Or if you'd like to just write me and tell me more about your thoughts and feelings, I promise to read it or listen purely from the perspective of listening and learning, and not in any way to defend myself. So if you get nothing from that, or you get another hostile response, you don't really have any good options beyond waiting for another year. I wish I could give parents 10 options, but there really aren't 10 options when children cut off contact, particularly once they're adults. So sometimes the best option is not to do anything. And that's what I call parenting at a distance. You're still being a parent because you're giving them something that they're saying they want and need, even if you don't like it, and even if you don't think it's the best thing for them to do, you're still giving them something that they feel like they want and need. So, that's why I recommend that, as hard as that is for parents to be able to do and to tolerate. Okay, so let's get more into the details about the ways that you can or should reach out. And if you're familiar with my work, you know that one of my favorite things to recommend that parents do is to write what I call a letter of amends, because I don't think there's any better way to get on the same page as the child, other than to let them know that you hear them, that you understand, that you're not there to defend yourself, to criticize anybody else, to blame anybody else. So they don't always work. There's nothing I can tell you that always works where I can say, look, you know what? Do my 5 best steps towards reconciliation, and I promise you a reconciliation. I can't. I wish I could. I think I can help you to feel better. I think I can give you what I think are the state-of-the-art tools towards a potential reconciliation, but there are a number of reasons why even the best efforts won't work. And I'll just repeat them. One is that your child may be too brainwashed from an alienation. The other is that they may be too held captive by the person they're married to, the cult of one, who says, choose them or me, you can't have both. 3 is that they may be involved in a bad therapy, who the therapist says they should be no contact, and that you traumatize them even though you didn't. 4th, they may be negatively impacted by your divorce, who you married the second or third time or whatever, or who your other children are. And 5th, because they just don't know any other way to feel separate from you than to reject you or to blame you. So for all of those reasons, your best efforts may come to naught. And I'm sorry and sad to say if that's true. But there are certain things that I think that you should absolutely do. And the first is a letter of amends. Now, why do I think that they're helpful? The first is that it's a kind of a concrete way of showing that you care. Now, whenever I tell parents that, they'll say, of course I care. They know I care. I've shown it in about a million ways. And of course you have. But that isn't the current game in town. The current game in town is where your child claims that you've wronged them in some way. And when that's at play, all of your good efforts and good memories have been pushed into the background. Now, not necessarily permanently, but permanently enough that you can't just remind them of that. Another reason they can be useful is that they take courage. You know that saying, it takes a strong person to say they're sorry. Our children may respect us more if we can fearlessly take responsibility for whatever way our choices or behavior were hurtful to them. 3, an amends letter can be useful because it contributes to clarifying what we're responsible for and what we're not. Ironically, the longer and louder that we protest that we were good parents, the harder they will have to raise their voices to prove that we're wrong. That's why parents are often surprised by how distorted the child's memories are. Children may have to exaggerate them to feel like they're getting on our radar. Well, you were always gone, or you were always so self-centered. The healthy response is simply to acknowledge that when you were gone, it was a problem, and whatever ways you were focused on yourself was problematic to your child. It should not be an exercise in self-hatred. Another reason amends are useful is that it can illustrate the separate realities nature of family life, that a parent could reasonably and objectively feel like they were a good parent and did a good job, and the child could objectively, reasonably feel like they wish that they'd done something different, and that in writing an amends, you're not saying, yes, I was so perfect, you're being so mean or cruel. You're saying, yeah, I guess I missed that. Maybe that was harder on you than I realized. Glad you let me know. The fifth reason is that it will actually paradoxically help you in your self-forgiveness and self-compassion. Part of forgiving ourselves for whatever mistakes we've made comes from feeling that we've done everything possible to repair the effect of our mistakes. So if we believe we've wronged our children, then we may believe that we're supposed to suffer for the rest of our lives. And knowing that we've done everything possible to reach out to them and have tried to make amends for whatever mistakes we've made is actually one of the most powerful ways to heal not only our relationships with them, but with ourselves. Real parenting is actually a minefield of mistakes. So there's no way you could be a parent and not have made mistakes. But the other reason that I think mistakes are therapeutic is that what stays in the dark grows in the dark. The more that we protest to our children or to ourselves, well, it wasn't so bad, or they're making a bigger deal out of it, or it's their therapist's fault, or my ex's fault, or whatever, it makes the feelings larger, not smaller. The more we can kind of go, yeah, these are the ways that I'm flawed. You know, in AA, they talk about make a searching and fearless moral inventory of your character flaws. And that's because in AA, not only do they want people to make amends to those that they've hurt, but they also recognize that the more in denial you are about your character flaws, the more you may drink around it, or the more you may feel upset about it and respond negatively to it. So another good reason for an amends is that it's simply good role modeling. Being able to be strong enough to face our flaws is part of being a good parent. It shows that we don't need to be perfect and that we can accept our inadequacies. Finally, they can be useful because they can help your child feel more separate and adult. It's a powerful way to show that you want a relationship of equals with your child, which is what they ostensibly want. It's not going to feel that equal to you because you don't actually have equal say about how you felt. But you're showing that you're willing to hear their ideas and their boundaries and their feelings about how being raised by you in the past, or whether it's distant or present, has impacted you. Now, these kind of letters and outreach are not easy for parents to do, and there's beliefs that can interfere with doing it. The first most common obstacle is the belief that I didn't do anything wrong. And I think the reason that that's hard for so many parents is that they feel like it's the equivalent of saying, I didn't do anything, I deserve the estrangement. So what I think you should tell yourself when you're writing it is, I didn't do anything wrong enough to deserve this, because I don't think people deserve to be estranged. I think there's reasons that people do it, and some maybe I'd even feel sympathetic to. I still don't think the parent deserves that. I think all parents are doing the best that they can even when they make terribly serious mistakes, because we're all products of our socioeconomic class, our genetics, our own family traumas, who we're married to, etc. And so the idea that parents should have to live in a permanent hell of estrangement because they made mistakes with their children, I just think is wrong. But another obstacle is that it makes me actually feel too bad about myself to face these mistakes. And that it's kind of an exercise in self-torment to really just get it all out on paper. The reality is, though, that it'll actually make you feel better ultimately. And that has to do with what I was saying earlier, that what stays in the dark grows in the dark. The more that we can kind of go, yep, these are my character flaws, could see why that was problematic for you, I'm really sorry, the more that allows us to kind of be able to face them and be more tolerant of ourselves, be more self-accepting, and have more self-compassion. Another obstacle is the belief that it's going to be used against you. And some might, I don't see it as much as parents going, adult children saying, well, okay, well, now even you're admitting it. It's more like, if there's going to be a criticism about an amends letter, it's typically that the parent didn't go far enough in the amends, that they kind of were too hedging in it. So another concern is that a worry that's going to reinforce their immaturity. But actually, if you're kind of trying to find a way to get on the same page as them, it will actually enforce their maturity. It'll actually enable their being more mature. So those are the obstacles to wanting to write the letter. But what about the actual letter? What kind of mistakes do people write? And I typically recommend that people write a letter rather than have a verbal conversation, because I think letters are easier to manage. You're not going to be triggered. I also recommend email over hard copy letters, because these kids are used to getting emails and it's harder for them to kind of throw it in the trash. Some might, but it's not as common. I think it invites more curiosity in a certain way. So what are the most common mistakes in writing in a letter? Well, the first one is that a lot of parents just don't go far enough. What I sometimes tell parents is, there has to be blood on the tracks. Your kid actually has to see you struggling with something that they know is really hard for you to acknowledge or admit to. So instead of saying, yes, I actually can be a really controlling person, or yes, you did suffer a lot as a result of the divorce and were put through a lot, and wouldn't have if we had been able to stay married, and I have to take responsibility for my part in that. Or yes, I should have protected you more from your stepfather. You have a right to feel disappointed that I didn't do a better job with that. The way it's more often stated is, well, I'm sorry that you felt like I should have been more protective of you. Or maybe I wasn't a perfect parent. Or I'm sorry you felt that I was a controlling person. Now, why is that wrong? Well, it's not exactly wrong. The parent is genuinely sorry that the child has that perception. It's that it's not actually taking any real responsibility. It suggests that the child's perception of the parent as flawed is wrong and is only a misperception that could be easily cleared up. Well, that's not the case. I would rather you face head on the ways that it's not a misperception. A second problem in outreach to the adult child is that parents just tend to be too defensive. And look, it's hard for us to hear our children's complaints and not get defensive. I understand. I've been there. I mean, it's hard to hear anybody's complaints about us that we care about and not get defensive. None of us wants to feel like we've disappointed somebody we love, especially our children. But defensiveness buys you nothing. It only makes you look like you're not really willing and able to take feedback, and it will always backfire. The third mistake, which may seem a little counterintuitive, is explanation. Because explanation, however human, misses the point. You can always try explaining your way back into your child's life, but it isn't likely going to work. If you say, well, I was a single mother, we didn't have much money, I was working 2 jobs, we didn't know as much about what kids needed back then, it was your dad's fault, it was your mom's fault. They don't want our explanations. They want our acknowledgement that we understand how they feel. It's what I do all day long, not only with estranged parents, but also with couples. Don't get into the right or wrong with it. The right thing to do is to empathize, to seek to understand, to be curious, and to take responsibility. Another mistake is sort of inadvertently blaming the child. You did have a lot of issues. You had ADD, you were an addict, you had learning disabilities. So the important point isn't whether they were or weren't difficult. Difficult kids are harder to raise. That is indeed a fact. It's just that it sounds like you're letting yourself off the hook. The other thing is blaming others, which I alluded to earlier, saying that it was your mom's fault, it was your dad's fault. Again, it just will make you look like you're not willing to take responsibility. So all of those things are really, really important to keep in mind. Now, I don't think parents have to do more than one good amends letter and then a follow-up 6 weeks later, 6 to 8 weeks later if you get nothing back. So, I don't think you have to write 10 amends letters or keep it up throughout the rest of their life. No, you write one good solid amends letter like I'm going to talk about. And then if you get nothing back in 6 weeks to 8 weeks, you just write one where you just say something like, hey, just checking in. Wanted to see if you've had a chance to look over the letter that I sent. I'm sure there were things that I put in it that left out that would have been good to have included. Mostly just wanted to see if it was possible to get a conversation started with you. Hope you'll let me know. Love, Mom, Dad, etc. Okay, so I've talked about what shouldn't be in the letter of amends. I've talked about the obstacles to writing one. So what should be in the letter? So the first is, if it's not clear, is you make a fearlessly honest admission of your mistakes. You express heartfelt empathy for how your child might have felt. You avoid responding to their anger by defending yourself. You express gratitude to them both at the beginning and at the end of it. You let them know you're open to talking about it again whenever he or she wants to in the future. Now, I know that some of you actually have no idea why your child is estranged. So in those cases, I encourage you to write what I call a flush them out of the bushes letter. Now, why do I say flush them out of the bushes? Because typically these kids are conflict avoidant, or they would have told you a long time ago what their complaints are. And, sometimes I'll see on the adult child's forum, well, they're saying they don't know, but I've told them 100 times. And there may be some tone-deaf parents out there. But there's also plenty of adult children who are conflict avoidant who haven't really told the parent what they're upset about. So if that's the case, if you don't know, then I encourage you to write a letter that goes something like this. Dear son or daughter, writing to see if it's possible to open up a dialogue with you. I know that you wouldn't have cut off contact unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. That said, I don't completely understand and would like to. It's clear that I have significant blind spots as a person and as a parent that I don't have a deeper understanding. But given that, I'm wondering if you'd feel comfortable writing me or telling me more about your thoughts or feelings that caused you to feel like this is what is best for you. I promise to read it or listen purely from the perspective of listening and learning and not in any way to defend myself. Love, Mom, Dad, etc. Okay, so what would a wrong letter look like, or a problematic letter? So that might sound like this. Dear Monica, I'm sorry you think I wasn't a good mother. I really tried to be the best one that I could, and given what I grew up with, I always felt like I did a pretty good job. It was very hard raising you as a single mother with very little money and no support from your father. I guess I should have tried harder. I'm not saying that I was always the most patient person in the world, but I did try and I did love you, and hopefully that counts for something. Okay, so why do I say that this is a problematic letter? Let's look at it on a step-by-step basis. I mean, first of all, if that was to a friend or somebody else, that might really qualify as a reasonable apology. But with adult children, it's going to have to be pretty darn clean in the ways that I'm going to talk about. So step by step, the first statement is, I'm sorry that you think I wasn't a good mother. The problem is that saying you think I wasn't a good mother sounds defensive. We all let our children down in one way or another. It's better to say, I'm sorry for the ways I wasn't a good mother, or I'm sorry for the pain that I have caused you. Second problematic statement is, I really tried to be the best one that I could. Now, the problem is that is a fact that she did, but the goal of the letter is to help the child believe that you're not there to defend yourself, but to see the world from their perspective. So remember, what you tell yourself is different from what you tell your child. You tell yourself you tried to be the best parent that you could, and maybe you actually were a great parent. You tell your child you're sorry for the ways that you weren't. Third problematic statement, I always felt like I did a pretty good job. Well, the problem for the purpose of this letter is that it's not relevant. The goal of the letter isn't self-expression. It's to communicate a willingness and desire to see things from the adult child's perspective. Right or wrong, they are currently fixated on the ways that they believe that you didn't do a good job, so defending yourself is going to be counterproductive. Fourth problematic statement, it was very hard raising you as a single mother with very little money and no support from your dad. Now, the most problematic part of that is the criticism of the dad. Again, while the parent is stating a real fact, it tempts the child to defend the other parent and distracts him or her from your positive intention. Fifth problematic statement, I did try and I did love you, and hopefully that counts for something. Well, saying hopefully that counts for something sounds critical, as though the child has no right to the perspective that they have. Therefore, it will make him or her feel defensive. And once your child feels defensive, then game over. Then the walls go up and then they stop listening. So that's why these letters are so important to get right, because you want to make sure that you're expressing yourself in a way that causes them to feel heard and understood, and not like you're trying to defend yourself. So given all that, what would a good letter sound like? I think it would sound like this. Dear Monica, I'm so sorry for the ways that I let you down as a parent. I know that I was harsh in many ways, and that was hurtful to you. I could understand why that might make it harder to spend time with me. It is true I was preoccupied in many ways when you were young, and that prevented me from being as involved with you as would have been good for you. I'm glad you let me know how you feel about that, and hope there are ways that I can make that up to you in the future. All right, so what's right about this letter? Well, the first statement, I'm so sorry for the ways that I let you down as a parent. It's right because it doesn't try to sugarcoat it. It goes straight to the heart of the complaint. Child saying, mother let her down as a parent. Mother saying she's sorry she did. Second, good statement, I know that I was harsh in many ways. It admits to being harsh is the strength. Again, makes it clear she's not there to prove the child wrong or overly sensitive. She's not telling the child all the ways that she wasn't harsh, or that she's exaggerating the number of times that she was, or even the volume of her harshness. She's just straightforwardly admitting that sometimes she was harsh and that was hard on the daughter. 3, and that was hurtful to you. Addresses how the mistakes or flaw resulted in the child feeling hurt. Number 4, I can understand why that might make it harder to spend time with me. The strength is that it empathizes with the child's decision to be distant. It shows strength that she's willing to both admit to her mistakes as a parent and respects the child's choices, however painful it is to the mother. 5th statement, I'm glad that you let me know how you feel. Now, the mother probably isn't glad that the daughter has told her, the ways that she's let her down as a parent, and the daughter probably knows that at some level. However, the mother's willingness to put the daughter's criticisms in the perspective of health rather than selfishness or hurtfulness is an act of selfless love on the part of the mother that is rarely missed by the adult child, even when they don't verbally acknowledge it. Now, for kids who are say they want to go no contact, then I typically recommend. Parents often say, well, they said they want to go no contact, so should I still reach out to them? And I would say that yes, you should. And you shouldn't wait either. People will often say, well, when is the best time? I mean, if your kid's in the midst of a crisis, probably not the best time, or some other huge developmental event. But in general, there's no time like the present. So if your child has said they want to go no contact, don't contact me, I still think you should at least write one good solid amends letter in the way that I recommend, which is you might start off by saying, just writing to see if it's possible to open up a dialogue with you. I know that you've requested that I not be in contact with you, and going forward, I will respect that. But I also want to say that I know you wouldn't be doing this unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. And if you know what the reasons are, that's when you would say them. I know that blah, blah, blah was hurtful and harmful to you, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If there are things that you'd like me to be working on while you're no contact, I'm in my own therapy, I'd be happy to do that. And if at some point you're open and willing to do family therapy, I would be willing to do that as well. So in other words, you kind of have it in the queue, because a lot of adult children, the letters that I've seen from them, really they like that the parent has said, I know you wouldn't do this unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, we may not feel like it's the healthiest thing for them to do. I may not think it's the healthiest thing for them to do, but it doesn't matter. You're trying to get on the same page that they are. And you're just saying that from their perspective, they wouldn't be doing it unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, this is just another way to emphasize that A lot of parents today still think that the idea of honor thy mother, thy father, respect thy elders, family is forever, is still the governing principle in American family life, but guess what? It's not. That ship has sadly sailed. I wish there was still more of that in our culture. I think we've lost respect for elders. I think we've lost the way to value the wisdom of elders. I think what I would say the crisis of grandparents being cut off from loving, decent grandparents being cut off from their grandchildren. This is a generation that talks a lot about their own traumas, but they're not particularly paying attention to the way that they're traumatizing their own children by ending a good, loving relationship with grandparents. And a lot of these estrangements that happen between grandparent and grandchild don't happen because the grandparent was so terrible. It happens because the adult child has problems with the parent, and they basically are saying, well, if it's not good for me, then it's not good for my child. Well, guess what? Something could not be good for you as a parent and still be good for your child. It might be good for them to just see that you can have conflict with them and they don't necessarily have that same conflict with them, or that people are complex and they're complicated. And a lot of times people may be really problematic in some ways and be amazing and loving in other ways. Or they may be really amazing grandparents even if they were not such great parents. Or being allowed to be good grandparents provides them a way to heal the way that they weren't good parents. But all this is a way to talk about the fact that to have a relationship with a child, an adult child these days, it requires parents to work harder. You have to be more psychological. You have to be more sensitive because nothing impels an adult child to have a relationship with that parent beyond that adult child's desire to have that relationship. Therefore, criticizing them for not being available, telling them that they're hurting your feelings, that you feel abandoned, neglected, that you don't feel appropriately valued, none of that is really going to work or be persuasive. The relationship has to occur in the context of growth and mental health and positivity. It's basically the same thing that people get married for today. People get married because they want their soulmate, and they get divorced if they're not their soulmate. Well, the same is true for parent-adult-child relationships today. That if the adult child doesn't feel like the parent is really somebody they can really be close to in the way that they believe that they want to be close to or should be close to, then they feel like the parent has no value. Now, I think that's a problem, but that doesn't matter, because what matters is the way your child is thinking about these things. And so my goal, and hopefully I achieve that today, some part, is to really give you the tools to be able to navigate these often very stormy waters. Thank you very much.